Hello, welcome to Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. Today is the History of Banking Part 2. Now, last time we discussed the migration of the Khazars along the southern end, along the Mediterranean into Spain and Portugal. We also came across, a little later, the Templar Knights escaping from France into Spain and Portugal. From there, they started voyages of discovery, thanks to the destruction of the spice trade over the Egyptian area in towards the Persian Gulf and then to India. Now, once that was done, we had to they had to now look for a new route to these spice islands. That is where we begin now, because once the Templars and the Jews had settled in Spain and Portugal, the balance of power was with them. They went all over. They went to the Americas. The Pope drew a line and Brazil went to Portugal. The rest of the Americas went to Spain. But the Portuguese went further on down the coast of Africa and into Angola and Mozambique. Now, these were Portuguese colonies, plus Vasco da Gama also rounded the Cape and went to Calicut, which is India. From there on, something else happened. The Spanish Inquisition began. Once that happened, the Templars, even though they were Roman Catholics, for some reason they fell foul of the Pope and they were persecuted. So all they did was they pulled up stakes and moved. They moved to England and Holland. And this is where the story really began. I can't understand why they didn't go to England in the first place. Because once they got there, they found the sort of protection they never had anywhere else. First of all, they settled in London, the city of London, which is at 1 square mile. It may be a very small area, but that one small area was not affiliated to the British Crown or the British government. It was affiliated to the Pope. Now that meant the British government and British law didn't apply here. Now, this particular area, this 1 square mile, has been associated with the Pope or affiliated with the Pope since the year 1213. So I can't understand why they went to Spain and Portugal in the first place. In this part, we're going to discuss first the fact that they've shifted to England and Netherlands or Holland. Second, how they set up and began. And third, the beginnings of the real banking system as we know it today. Now, having got to England, one thing did emerge. First, the Templar cross disappeared from the sails of these ships. Now, once they moved, they also took their navy, both the military navy as well as the merchant navy, with them. They were no longer based in Spain, and Spanish and Portuguese power or sea power declined substantially. And the balance of power shifted to England and Holland. This combination of Templar Knights and Jews now supported and financed the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. The result was all of East Africa, South Africa, India, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, the trade with China, also the occupation of Australia and New Zealand, all went into British hands. The Dutch merely managed Indonesia, and they stayed there till about the 1940s. The other thing we must understand is these voyages of discovery were not really voyages of discovery, but voyages of colonization. And the importance of this was that a lot of stuff, a lot of wealth was plundered from all these colonies and taken back to Europe. First it was to Spain and Portugal, and then to England and Holland. Later on, the French also went into Indochina, but the French occupation was basically confined to North Africa and North African countries as we know today. Now, not only were these voyages of colonization important, but there's one other thing. These ships also carried slaves from West Africa to the Americas. In those days, this was the Golden Triangle. England down to West Africa, as Ghana mainly, it was known as the Gold Coast then, and then to the Americas, and then back to England with the wealth. Now, the reason I tend to think that a lot of Jewish influence was there, because of the way they treated those slaves. For every 3 they took, only 1 arrived in the Americas. It tells a great deal about how they were treated. Because 2 Jews, especially Khazar Jews, who were basically Talmudic Jews, not Sephardic Jews, they were being Talmudic Jews. All other people were goods, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and human beings went alongside with them. All other human beings were there to serve them. They were not even human, as far as they were concerned. Now, this is something which today we find difficult to understand or fathom, but it was true, and in many instances it still happens today. Now, thanks to colonization, a lot of wealth was pillaged and plundered and looted from the colonies and brought back to Europe. As I said, first it was Spain and Portugal, now it changed hands and went to England and Holland. Thus, conflict began in Europe. Why? The colonies were there to be plundered, but where was the wealth? It was now in Europe. So, internal rivalry within Europe became quite open. The French and the English, they were always at it. And this culminated a few years later, or a little while later, in Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed almost the whole of Western Europe at the time. Now, once the pillage and plunder and loot from the colonies started pouring in, just how valuable it was, you understand, if you go to Portsmouth Harbour in England, you'll see a museum, a naval museum sort of thing, and you see a wooden ship which is still afloat. It was a man of war. This particular ship was Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, from the Battle of Trafalgar. Yes, Nelson lost his life there, but victory was complete. The French fleet was, and the French naval power was smashed. However, if you look closely at that ship, you will notice one thing. If you go to the captain's cabin, there's a little plaque there that says, "Built by that damn nigger," which is the way most British officers address the people at the shipyard. And this ship was made in Bombay. Yes, I said Bombay in India, because this ship was built out of teak wood. Could not have been made in England, because British ships were always made of British oak, certainly at that particular moment in time. Now one begins to understand what the colonies meant, when even ships and British battleships were actually made in India. Now, having got so much from the colonies, they now turned their attention to Europe. And here's where the interesting bit begins. How it began, we don't know. It is all shrouded in secrecy. But this is probably the first time one hears the name Rothschild. And this is a name you must remember, because even today it holds sway over much of the world. Now, the first one hears of the Rothschilds is Mayor Amschel Rothschild. And this man was in Frankfurt in Germany. Now, how he got there, we don't know. But that is where we hear of him as a wine seller, maybe even a winemaker. Now he had 5 sons and he taught them banking. How he learned banking we don't know, because Jews usually went in for usury, which means lending money to individuals. Banking is something they would not have known much about. But the Templar Knights knew about banking, which tends to make me believe that the Rothschilds were not really Jews, but Templar Knights or their descendants. Now, having taught them all his 5 sons banking, he sent them out into Europe. The eldest stayed in Frankfurt. The youngest, Jacob, went to Paris in France. The third son, the most capable, Nathan Rothschild, was sent to London. The other 2, one went to Vienna in Austria, the other went to Naples. Now these were the 5 centers of both culture and trade and power in Europe at that particular time. Now Nathan Rothschild was probably the most successful, being in London, being also the most capable. And they had also found that lending money to individuals was a chancy business. But lending money to governments, they were sure of repayment with interest. They couldn't lose that way. And this is where the banking mafia really took off and began its nefarious activities. Since about 1795 or 1800, every war or every skirmish anywhere in the world, you will find this particular families behind it. Whether it was the Napoleonic Wars, the American Wars, the 1810s and 1820s, the Crimean War, the Boer War, World War I, World War II, right through to Vietnam, Korean War, the invasion of Iraq and so on. And this is what I mean, the banking mafia. And it is no less, because they have a stranglehold. And what was their plan? First, control America. From there, control the world. And what was their plan? They started doing this in the 1820s. First, the Federal Reserve Bank, or its predecessor, which began, it lapsed in the 1830s. The next one went on, it ate up Abraham Lincoln because he tried to take power away from them and they had him assassinated. In around 1870, this one was voted out. The next one, which came up around, well, it began in 1908. There's a very secret meeting in Jekyll Island. A whole lot of people who are fierce competitors in the market met in secret. And they found out, they propounded this particular act. People who were there were representatives and sometimes actual of the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Harrimans, and a whole lot of others. Even the Carnegies probably. Now the reason was they had something big in mind, and believe me, it was. First, they aided and began women's suffragette, women's emancipation. Not because they think, that women were depressed and so on, but because only 50% of the people were paying tax. Now you get the women out to work, 70 to 80% are now ready to pay tax. Their children are now in creches. So you can now educate them in your way and indoctrinate them starting at a much younger age. The Rockefellers also went out and started getting interested in the health of the nation. How? First, they got homeopathy outlawed in the States. Then, somewhere along the way, they took over Pfizer's, the biggest drug company in the world. Now, once you do that, and you've got the health of the nation in your hands, you've got their education in your hands, through the Federal Reserve Act, you now have their money in your hands. Now, with these three, you literally got a stranglehold. The Rothschilds, starting from England, made a lot of money during the Napoleonic Wars. How? Nathan Rothschild financed the Duke of Wellington for England. Jacob Rothschild financed Napoleon, the French government. The other brothers financed a lot of other nations like Austria, Hungary, Prussia, Germany, and Holland, again for war preparation, all against Napoleon. Now, war preparation means cannon, gun carriages, cannonballs, powder, guns or muskets, musket balls, powder, horses, saddles, spears, swords, you name it. The amount of material needed was huge, and the amount of money needed was even more important. Where would they get it from? The only people were the Rothschilds. Not only that, let's see what Nathan Rothschild did. He had his own observer watching and observing the Battle of Waterloo. When it was decided, he came straight back to London 24 hours before the Duke of Wellington's own courier got back to England. Nathan Rothschild, first thing in the morning, went, stood in his normal place at the stock exchange, and got all his agents to sell all the British government bonds, or the British consuls as they were called. Everybody else saw this and thought Napoleon had won. So they started disposing of their consoles at throwaway prices. Around 2:30, nearest 3 in the afternoon, word went out that all of Nathan Rothschild's agents were now buying up all these consoles at 10% of face value. By doing this, he multiplied his wealth 20 times in that one day. Now you understand where he got control not only of the British Stock Exchange, but through that and his wealth, also the Bank of England. Now, in 1913, under the presidency of President Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And then, that is where everything began to take off. In the 1920s, what happened? First, getting a loan was easy. The system used in America was fractional reserve banking. Once any bank borrowed, say, $100 from the Federal Reserve, they could now lend $1,000 and charge interest on it. They became rich. They financed local businesses, home buying, things like this. Now, as long as money supply was there, all this was possible. But then the big banks had another idea. They reduced the money supply by almost 30%. Result? Everybody was in a fix. The local banks started foreclosing loans. And they had the power to do so, and once they foreclosed, the person had 24 hours in which to repay. Distress sales occurred. They took over businesses, houses, and everything else. And there were long lines. People lost jobs. They lost their homes. Long lines for, sort of community kitchens and things like this. Not only that, they also got the government to make the holding of gold illegal. It had to be now given in at banks. Now, they brought it into the banks at $20 an ounce. The banks took it and brought it to Europe for safekeeping. In 1945, Bretton Woods Agreement, You could now sell gold and own gold, but they now could sell it at $35 an ounce. They made a 75% increase in their value immediately for doing nothing. Now, this was a sort of trickery which the banks indulged in. And having got all this done, they also did something else. They bought up all the newspapers, the television, the news channels, the radio shows, newspapers, magazines, periodicals, everything. And they also started buying up all the publishing houses. Now, you got to remember, the Rothschild had bought over Reuters press or news service in the 1880s. Reuters press now bought Associated Press in the 1920s. Associated Press is still the body which collates all the news on a day and then puts out what they want everybody else to hear and think, and how they should think and how they should look at it. The real problem with the Federal Reserve is it is not owned by the US government. It is owned by a group of private bankers. Now, the main ones in this are the third tier is your Harrimans, the Rockefellers, the JP Morgans. The next two are your Schiffs and the Warburgs and Kuhn and Loebs, this sort of conglomerate. And right on top is the Rothschilds. They have controlling interest. Not only that, all the multinationals are controlled again by the Rothschild through the Bank of International Settlements, which is also a privately owned bank, but again, the Rothschilds own controlling interest in that bank. So not only America, but American trade all over the world is also controlled. Now we begin to understand the big thing behind all this. Not only that, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Now nobody could ask for gold in exchange for dollars, which means that the American dollar is only paper money. It's no longer backed by gold, unlike other countries which necessarily have to have gold or something backing their currency. Now it's very strange, and yet the American dollar is so high. Why? Because they managed to get Saudis to sell oil only in dollars. So to buy oil, you must buy dollars, hence its price. It's still a high priced commodity. Now, how far have the Rothschilds grasped or grabbed everything? They control the price of gold every day in the bullion market. They control the exchange rates every day. They control the metals exchange. Now, once you've got all this in your hands, how much more do you have? Do you need? You've got the world currency, you've got gold, and you've got all your major metals. That's it. It proves beyond all shadow of doubt Mayor Amschel Rothschild's boast. Give me the power over a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws. Now we understand how the entire currency system of the world is not only taken over but controlled by that one family. Now, recent wars, for instance, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, why? Why have they gone after them? Up to 2001, there were only 6 countries in the world, 6, whose central reserve banks were neither owned nor controlled by the Rothschilds. Who were they? North Korea, Cuba, Sudan, Iran, Iraq, Libya. Those are the only 6. Now, North Korea, they're waiting for something with China. Cuba they can take over anytime. It's too small. Iraq has been taken over already. Saddam Hussein is gone. Libya has been taken over. Gaddafi has been gone, have been removed. Iran is the only one they're still chasing after. And they would have done it, except for Russian intervention. Syria is also being messed up totally. Now remember one thing, all this happening in the Middle East was known 11 months before 9/11, which is another story. Now you begin to understand how one or two families control the world. They control our money, they control our lives, they control which country goes up or which country goes down. They control our daily lives, and yet we don't know it. Simply because we're too busy, and we're kept too busy trying to make ends meet. We don't know where the next strike is coming from. And until we wake up, UN is going to be the colonizing agency for the whole world. We better get up. We better wake up soon and quickly. So folks, we hope you like this video. If you do, please don't forget to press the subscribe button, the like and share buttons of this particular channel, Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. All the best, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all of you.